Chrono Odyssey is a dark fantasy MMORPG developed by Chrono Studios and is published by Kakao Games. I managed to obtain an invite to the closed beta, which gave me just a little bit of time to check it out and play around with it, just to see how far it's come since it started development. The game aims to implement real-time Souls-like combat instead of the traditional tab-based targeting systems that MMOs typically use. The game also provides players with a skill tree which allows them to unlock new abilities and attacks depending on the class and weapons that they are using. Chrono Odyssey also allows players to take on dungeons and world bosses to obtain better loot. Players can also go trading, hunting, fishing and gathering in order to improve their life skills as well as their gear. Aside from that, the developers really wanted to create an open world environment which featured a lot of biomes, stunning visuals, a good soundtrack and also a theme which seems to be inspired by either Alien or Prometheus. One of the main things about the game is the Chronotector item, which allows the players to reverse time and pause time as well as freeze monsters. So the developers are aiming for a Q4 2025 release date. The game's been in development since early 2021, so it's been about 4 years so far. However, how is the game in its current state? Is it any good? Do I think it's gonna succeed? To be honest, I think that the game is a little bit of a mess and that the developers have a lot of things that they need to fix. So I've played the game for a couple of hours now, and so I thought I'd give some of my thoughts on it, on things like the combat, the life skills, the graphics, the visuals, the soundtrack, character creation, and also other parts of the game. Okay, so the first thing that's going to happen when you start a new game is you're going to be asked to choose your class. You can choose from a sorcerer that specializes in destructive spells, an assassin that specializes in stealth and rapid attacks, a berserker, which sounds rather like the assassin, but I'm assuming more tanky, a paladin, which main focus is on healing other party members, and a ranger that uses a bow and rapier for a DPS, and a swordsman, which acts as a tank to absorb damage and protect party members with a sword and shield. The first three are locked in this closed beta test, so in this case I decided to go for the ranger. This is where we're now met with our character creation. First thing you're going to be asked to do is to choose a face preset. I thought they weren't too bad, but they were rather standard and nothing too interesting to look at. After this, you're asked to choose a body type which determines the weight proportions of your character, ranging from pretty skinny to pretty fat. For some reason, these all just felt a little bit off, but I couldn't really put my finger on it. Maybe it was the really long legs that the characters have. Honestly, I don't really know, they just looked really weird. Moving past the body presets, you are presented with a whole bunch of sliders that let you adjust pretty much anything, from skin color, neck circumference, calf length, chest size, shoulder width, hair sheen, and a whole ton more. The main issue here is that I feel like there's a little bit too much freedom. I spent a good 40 minutes putting all the sliders in different directions, creating an absolute abomination. Unfortunately, all my efforts went to waste as the server shut down for maintenance. I decided to leave it until the next day as it was getting pretty late anyway, and when I returned I decided to take it a bit more seriously. I think it's safe to say that if you put in even just a little amount of effort, you can get something pretty good. I made small adjustments here and there, and I think in the end she actually turned out to be kind of pretty, although I did spend roughly an hour making a lot of tweaks. Overall, for the character customization, I did find it to be somewhat decent, although there was a couple of issues that stood out. I wasn't really a fan of the whole no gender lock thing. Essentially what this means is that you don't choose a gender. Instead you just make your character look like a woman or a man based on a preset that you choose. I didn't like this because I don't really understand why you'd play as a woman, yet be given the option to have a full-on beard of a grown man. Both this and the ability to create stupid-looking characters is just silly because the game takes place in a medieval fantasy setting, which is supposed to have a serious story and tone, but this cross-gender thing just doesn't feel or make any sense. If the developers can't take the characters seriously, then how can we take the story and world seriously when the characters are a big part of that world? Now, another thing that I noticed is that I couldn't get the tattoos to appear on the body. I'm assuming they're kind of bugged. You can also choose several piercings, but they're all on the face and there is no option for any body piercings. There are also some hairstyle options which seem to have invisible textures. I also tried to get the pointy elf ears as seen in the class selection screen, but there was no combination of sliders I could find that actually allowed me to have them. Lastly, I found it quite difficult to customize my character exactly the way I wanted. I don't think you'll be making a model anytime soon. There were also no options to save a preset or load other players' presets. However, Black Desert Online is another MMORPG game which has provided this option for years. As for the combat, the first thing to realize is that you are going to have a certain set of skills available to you depending on the class that you chose. In my case, I chose the ranger, so I had the bow and rapier weapons. Each weapon has their own abilities. For example, I can unlock abilities only for the rapier, or I can unlock ones for the bow. To use the abilities, you first need to switch to your corresponding weapon using the Q key. This took a little while to get used to, as most games usually let me change weapons using the number keys. Now, in the introduction scenes, you are going to have a chance to test out and play around with your skills and weapons. However, once you have moved on past the introduction, you are going to have everything stripped away from you, including your skills and armor. You're then going to start the game with essentially nothing, and you're going to have to level your character in order to unlock your skills again. After about 2 to 3 hours of playing, I managed to unlock around 4 or 5 of my skills. To be honest though, I didn't really feel like the skill tree was very in-depth. From the brief look I took at it, it seemed very bare bones. It didn't seem like there was much in the way of customization, and I don't think you'd be able to create a unique build that other players may not have. Now, the game does provide a lock-on feature which actually felt quite snappy. However, I noticed that I was forced to lock on to an enemy as soon as I attacked one. This became quite annoying, as often I wanted to attack multiple enemies at once, but instead I was forced to focus on one enemy at a time. Luckily, I found that I was able to disable this auto lock-on feature in the game settings. Moving on, your basic attacks are light and heavy attacks, which can simply be performed using left and right click respectively. When using a ranged weapon, you can also land critical hits when aiming for the head. I actually thought that the light and heavy attacks weren't too bad, as they provided a decent feeling of weight and impact whenever they landed. It's a lot better than Black Desert Online, for example, where the feedback is pretty much non-existent. However, in Chrono Odyssey, I feel like the animations and sound effects provide enough feedback that the combat felt pretty good. One thing to note is that I could not make out any indication of hit freeze frames during combat. Some people might dislike the lack of them, however it is something I prefer not to have, so I'm glad I didn't really find it here. If you don't know what hit freeze frames are, basically it's an effect which makes the game freeze for a split second whenever the player lands an attack. Many believe this provides the feeling of impact and weight, however I find it to be extremely jarring, and any game that implements it looks like it's full of stutters and glitches. I struggle to understand why people like them. In my opinion, it's the worst thing that can be implemented into any game. Yet despite this, it seems more and more common for developers to include it. The new Silent Hill F game is a good example of why it looks like absolute shit. Monster Hunter Rise also includes hit freeze frames, and is another example of how jarring it looks. In the end, I'm just kinda glad that I didn't really come across them in this game since they're so common these days. Now, the game does provide the ability to dodge using the shift key. However, I found this to be pretty much useless, as I seem to be getting hit regardless of whether I dodged an attack or not. You can see in this boss fight I was getting hit from really far away, even after dodging out of the way. This became quite frustrating because it didn't really make the boss fight feel fair at all, and pretty much made him impossible to defeat, as one hit would instantly kill you. It's quite clear that the developers did not optimize the hitboxes enough and left it far too big for the boss's weapon. One other thing to note is that you can sheath your weapons. When you do this, you can go prone using the X key and also crouch using the Z key. I thought this was quite cool and reminded me a bit of similar maneuvers found in Black Desert Online. The animations when moving between these positions were very fluid and seemed really well put together. Overall, I think the combat is okay, however the skill tree just seemed a bit too bare bones and didn't offer much in the way of customization. I also felt like the attacks didn't actually make contact with the enemies and instead just kind of played the attack and animation in their direction. In The Witcher 3, the combat is quite detailed and you can visually see when your sword makes contact with the enemy. Obviously, The Witcher 3 is a single player game and Chrono Odyssey is an MMORPG, so there's technical limitations to consider when hosting thousands of players on online servers. It just serves as a good example of what I mean. I also found that there was some kind of delay in the blood sword trail effects when my attacks landed. Lastly, my character often felt like it was gliding around when moving side to side. It just didn't look or feel quite right. Other than that, the combat is kind of there and it's honestly not too bad, but it does require a bit of work. The game makes the life skill system known to the player quite early on. In the first town, you're going to come across a quest which introduces you to forging your own armor using materials. To get these materials, you need certain tools which you don't really start with. For example, to gather plants, you're going to need to craft a sickle. To gather ore, you will need to craft a pickaxe. Wood requires a logging axe. Gathering meat requires a butcher knife. Hunting fish requires a fishing pole. To cook food, I believe you need to craft a campfire. Each of these tools have upgraded variations which require more materials to make. Some plants can also be gathered by hand without a tool, such as thicket. The same goes for some rocks. You can pick up flint by hand, but obviously to actually mine, you're going to need a pickaxe. Aside from the tools, you can craft weapons as well, such as swords, shields and daggers. You can also craft armor such as helmets, chest pieces and boots. And you can also craft food items which will provide your character with buffs, so overall, it's pretty standard stuff you'd expect from MMOs. I don't want to spend too much time here as I don't really get to check out the life skills too much. However, one thing that I noticed is that I mostly found sugarcane and flint alongside streams and rivers. I thought this was kind of cool since this is actually where they're found in the real world, so it was kind of realistic. Although I don't actually know if this is just a flint and sugarcane thing, or if the developers gave the same thought to other resources in the world. I know that a lot of other players stated that they found the resource spawns to be fairly random. In the end though, I found gathering resources around the map was actually quite enjoyable, and I actually enjoyed it more than anything else in the game. I'd find myself spending more time going out of my way to gather something I might not need, instead of participating in combat or quests. This might sound good, but obviously the game is meant to be focused on the combat and the story, so the fact that gathering resources in the game is more enjoyable kind of makes it feel like the developers are prioritizing the wrong things. So the questing system is quite standard, and completing quests will reward you with some loot. I didn't really find quests very interesting, to be honest. They were quite typical fetch quests, and also quests where you're tasked with killing 5 boar or whatever. One early quest had an NPC that will follow you around. It was a bit weird at first, but I found it to be quite immersive, as it helped add a sense of interaction between me and the game world. Now, I'd become confused with navigating many quests, as the map often provided little to no indication of where exactly I was meant to go. Instead, I found myself relying on the compass at the top of my screen to get a vague direction, and I would have to just combine this with my own intuition. Later on, I did realise there is sometimes a faint vertical light placed in the world, which kind of acts as a beacon for where I was meant to be. However, at first I had no idea this existed, and ended up completely missing it. Some quests did add a marker on the map of where I was meant to go, but in those cases I kind of felt like the quests relied too much on the map menu instead of providing enough information by themselves. When it came to exploration, it was quite underwhelming, and a lot of aspects of the game was just lacking. For example, the city was pretty much dead, with the only NPCs existing are the ones you need for questing and crafting. Aside from those, you have the occasional guard, but they do not even do anything. You can't talk to them, and attacking them does not provoke some sort of reaction. They kinda just stand around like decorative statues, and there's literally no background NPCs, no NPCs that wander around shopping, no NPCs that are eating meals, no NPCs training in combat, no NPCs washing their clothes or whatever, there's just none of them. This might sound rather pointless, but in reality, having NPCs in the background doing these things can really add life and realism to the environment. The lack of NPCs and the lack of interaction ended up making the world pretty empty, bland, and void of life. Now, there are these things called Eye of Insight scattered around the world. These are tall structures that allow you to uncover parts of the map which were previously blank. These are sort of like the point of interest in Assassin's Creed that essentially do the same thing. There are also supply crates which are hidden away in different parts of the map. I stumbled across one of these by chance when messing about near some cliffs. Additional loot can be found in breakable objects placed around dangerous areas. These areas seem to be scattered throughout the map. The starting town also has things you can simply loot from. This was not considered stealing, and again did not provoke any reaction from the guards. The size of the map felt huge, and the cliffs felt very tall. Some of these cliffs were terrifying to fall from. When jumping off cliffs, you will obviously die, and I learned the hard way that water will not break your fall. There are also pretty much no interiors. I mean, yes, there are main buildings in the city which you can walk into, but all of the other buildings, such as NPC houses, cannot actually be entered. I found this odd considering the doors had a message on them stating that they were locked. When angling my camera correctly, I was able to clip my view through the walls. The insides of the buildings were then exposed, and they were quite empty. Now, you do have world bosses which are placed around the map, such as giant scorpions, dragons, and giant wolf-like creatures. You also have the main quest boss, which seems like you can attempt at any time. For some reason, there are also exploding ducks. Two things that I should quickly mention as well is that I did come across a contract board in the starting city. I thought this was quite cool, but I couldn't actually accept any quests from them. I'm not sure if they were just bugged or if they were meant to be a feature planned for the full release of the game. There are also merchants around the world which you can buy things from. One of the merchants was selling a horse. I noticed that there were also stables around the map, which I assumed would let you summon your horse if you were to buy one. Overall, I think both the questing and exploration was extremely lacking and was very uninspiring, with almost nothing that sets them apart from the other countless MMOs already out there. These two things have to be the most boring parts of the game so far. I find it really disappointing that in 2025 we still do not have developers that are willing to add explorable interiors or come up with more engaging questlines. What is even worse is the lack of reactions from NPCs, whether you are trying to attack them or are stealing around the town. Elder Scrolls Online is another MMO which released 10 years ago and has all of these features. The developers have a lot of work to do on these aspects of the game if they want it to be successful. So the main theme the developers seemed to be going for was that of Alien or Prometheus. This is evident from the twisted black and grey tube-like structures surrounding the main bosses. Even the main bosses have a very much Alien and Prometheus-like design to them. For example, look at this scene where the first boss drops out from a cocoon. You can also see in the ship design the inspiration from these franchises. They looked very iconic and impressive when seen for the first time, especially when considering their scale. As for the story, I found it to be quite boring to begin with. Over time though, I began to pay a little bit more attention to it as I was a little bit interested to see where these aliens came from and what exactly they were. One thing I appreciate here is that there was no dialogue spam or lore dumping. Instead, all of the dialogue was kept very concise and easy to skim through. This means if you wanted to pay attention to the story, then it probably won't cost you too much time. Despite all of this, it was still pretty boring. Aside from the aliens, I wasn't really interested in anything else that the story had to offer. When it came to the voice acting, I thought it was quite bad. There's not really much to say about it, other than it felt like grown adults reading you a child's storybook.
I am Romek, humble pilgrim of Chronos. Though I may seem no more than a beggar, 'tis far from the truth.
Overall, the theme was pretty cool, but the story was boring and the voice acting was awful, which is typical for a lot of MMOs to be honest. One of the first things about this game that stood out to me was the environment design. Looking out across the landscapes to see vast valleys and impressive structures was a sight to behold. The colour palette was also quite nice. The developers took to a more mature colour scheme consisting of mainly earthy colours such as browns, beiges and forest greens. Both the vast landscapes and colour palette combined created an atmosphere that really helped sell the idea of a large dark fantasy world. I also noticed how the armour had their own independent cloth physics that allowed them to sway behind your character as you moved around. Although it was a little bit exaggerated, it was a nice touch that helped make the armour pieces look a bit more immersive and realistic. There was also some very extreme special effects when using a fast travel point known as bound stones. Activating the bound stone causes the structure to ripple apart into different pieces that rotate and fold over before transforming the entire thing into a mechanical locking door. You then see a weaving light as your character opens the door before stepping into it, taking you to wherever your destination is. I thought this was probably one of the best graphical parts of the game and probably one of the best looking fast travel systems I have ever seen in a game. It looked very cool. Now unfortunately, this is where the good things kind of stop when it comes to the graphics. Firstly, you will probably have noticed by now, the lighting in this game is incredibly sharp and harsh. When approaching the first city, all of the lighting was buggy and would flicker really quickly between light and dark. Most of the textures will not load in, even when you are standing right next to them, and instead will look really blurry. There were also distant structures that looked like half their mesh was missing or not being rendered properly. Rock and cliff textures felt like one of the worst offenders when it came to blurry textures, and they didn't even have any grass on them. They looked very flat or like something from a PS2 game. There was also a lot of LED pop-ins on trees, items, fog, buildings, and more. Many seams on the road and ground textures were blatantly visible. The developers put no effort into blending them together. There is a fairly strong vignette around the screen which I couldn't turn off. The map menu had a really low resolution and looked really pixelated whenever I zoomed in. The crafting menus for forging tools, weapons and armor had really blurry icons and often parts of the icons were to be cut off. Not completely graphical related, but the hitboxes around some objects like benches and tables were just extremely wrong, and they'd block your character's path even when you could clearly fit past them. Lastly, the game looked absolutely horrendous on 1080p screens. I would go as far to say that it's unplayable at 1080p. The game is just so visually noisy and I had so much eye strain just looking at anything in the game. And just to be clear, I tested both 1080p and 1440p, and even on 1440p my eyes were straining to see things on the screen. The graphics are just really poor. Everything looked like a blurry, smeary, oily mess. It feels and looks extremely cheap and nothing like a AAA game. It barely even feels like the developers put effort into the graphics at all. The performance, as you might have figured out already, is really bad. At both medium and high settings, this game barely reaches over 30 frames per second. Going into a city makes this immediately drop down to about 17 frames per second, and standing inside of a building, the FPS will climb back up to 30 frames per second again. This is just completely bizarre and makes absolutely no sense since I have not left the city and I can still see everything outside. Sometimes the game will just freeze for a couple of seconds for no apparent reason, before continuing on like nothing happened. The loading screens also seem completely broken visually and will often lock up the game momentarily. The map menu is also really laggy after activating an Eye of Insight. The in-game cinematics were also completely broken and are unwatchable due to constant freezing and stuttering. At this point I should mention that my computer is quite beefy and has an RX 7700 XT graphics card. Just for you NVIDIA users out there, this graphics card sits between an RTX 4060 Ti and a 4070. My computer can run games like The Last of Us Part 1 and Black Desert Online at 70 to 80 frames per second, cranked up to max settings at 1440p ultra-wide. I can even play Warhammer Vermintide 2 at 4K ultra-wide over 30 FPS at max settings with reshade installed. Chrono Odyssey does not even look 1/4 as good as Black Desert Online, Last of Us, or even Vermintide, yet it performs not even half as good. There is literally no valid reason why my computer cannot run this game over 60 FPS. Now, you might have figured out by now that these are classic symptoms of an Unreal Engine 5 product. All of these issues I've listed about the graphics and performance could be caused by either Unreal Engine 5, lazy development, or a combination of both. In my honest opinion, the developers made their biggest mistake when they decided to use Unreal Engine 5 for their project. If people who have 1080p screens can't see anything on the screen or can't even get good performance, I don't see why they'd even want to play it. The Steam hardware survey of June 2025 reports that 55% of users own a 1080p display, 20% of users own a 1440p display, and only 4% of users own a 4K display. And the most popular GPU at this date is also the RTX 4060. So the developers have a lot of optimizing to do if they want this game to be successful, because as of now, the performance alone makes this game unplayable. So there are some things I didn't really go over. This is because they were either minor issues that don't really affect the game too much, or just issues that are a little more trivial or come across like pet peeves. This includes things like the user interface, camera, bugs, censorship, etc. Now in this case, there seems to be a bit of political injection when it comes to the female NPCs. Some of them are designed to be more masculine, which occasionally threw me off a bit. Most of the armor in the game also covered the female characters completely. I'm not certain if they did this as a form of censorship or if this was just their honest design. In this modern day and age, it is very common to see censorship in the form of covering every inch of skin on female characters. However, I can undress my character all the way down to their underwear, so perhaps censorship was not something the developers were thinking too much about. The camera in the game is quite standard, but it's also a bit far out and a bit too high up. There are no settings or sliders to customize the camera's position relative to your character. Bushes and plants also get in the way of the camera quite a bit, especially when looking towards the sky. This became an issue when in combat. The developers could fix this by fading out grass, trees, bushes and rocks whenever the camera gets too close. The developers seemed like they wanted a minimal heads-up display, but in reality the heads-up display looked really clunky and took at least 1/3 of my screen up. There was also an option to scale down the user interface in the settings. However, I believe this would have scaled everything down, so I did not feel this was a good solution, as scaling everything down would have made the fonts look a little bit too small. I think it would have been better if the developers added an option to change the size of the heads-up display at the bottom of the screen independently from everything else. One thing I did appreciate when it came to the heads-up display was the auto-hide when not in combat. This allowed me to enjoy a cleaner and uncluttered screen when exploring and gathering. The controls were also very standard and was easy to pick up. However, I did find the escape key did not exit menus, and the E key does not confirm things despite it saying so on the screen. I didn't like the fact that there was no option for a 16:9 aspect ratio resolution on a 21:9 ultrawide monitor. This would have been good obviously for performance reasons, but also because I needed to record for YouTube. There was, however, an option to scale the heads-up display to different aspect ratios despite your monitor's resolution. In this case, I was able to play and record the game on ultrawide, but have the HUD sit on my screen as if it was on a standard 16:9 monitor. Aside from the flickering lighting, I did come across two bugs that stood out to me. When leaving the starting area in the prologue, I looked behind me and saw all of the monsters pause as if they were frozen in time. Another bug that stood out, and which I found kind of amusing, was guards which kind of got stuck in the floor and they would endlessly loop in a walking animation. After a few hours of playing, taking notes, and eventually getting tired of the game's performance issues, this is where I decided to wrap things up. So after checking out Chrono Odyssey's closed beta test for a while, my first thoughts were as follows. For the things that I liked, the environment design and landscapes are incredible. The scenery at times is some of the best I've ever seen inside of an MMO. Seeing these huge, strange structures of epic proportions really made the world feel vast and expansive. The game has an interesting theme that at times sold the dark fantasy feeling really well. Seeing one of the bosses slipping outside of a cocoon-like thing and stretching up with its weapon really reminded me of a mix between Alien and Prometheus. The game at times had some really cool special effects. Seeing the boundstones break apart and transform into a door revealing a portal was undoubtedly one of the best moments in the game. Gathering in the game is really satisfying and enjoyable. Even though I did not need to collect materials, I often found myself going out of my way just to collect some flint down from a nearby riverbed or chopping down a tree for some wood. You could even see the trees fall over when they are chopped by you or other players, which was really immersive. It's rare to come across an MMO which has such satisfying and interesting gathering mechanics. For the things that I disliked, I didn't really like how much freedom the character creator gives to the players. There are obviously going to be players who will abuse this and intentionally create monstrosities that will ruin your immersion. While I did find the combat to feel quite impactful when my hits connected with things, overall I still felt it to be quite lacking in responsiveness. Sometimes it was difficult to hit an enemy even though they were standing right in front of me. Instead, my attacks would just land beside them. Characters often looked like they were gliding around when moving side to side, and the dodge also felt quite useless as I'd be getting hit regardless of whether I rolled out the way or not. I disliked how there was little to no background NPCs. The only background NPCs that did exist were guards, but they were completely unresponsive to my attacks or acts of theft. Questing in this game was extremely boring, with the same typical fetch quests we've seen over and over again in countless other MMOs, with nothing that really sets this one apart. I found navigating some quests was confusing as there was often little to no indication of where to go. I disliked the awful voice acting. It was really poor and came across as if you were being read a children's storybook. This didn't really fit in with what's supposed to be a mature, dark fantasy world. The graphics in this game is extremely poor, with blurry textures, lots of pop-ins, texture seams in the roads, half-rendered structures, and terrible glitchy lighting. The performance is also abysmal, barely reaching over 30 frames per second on a decent computer. There are also lots of stutters and freezes, and bizarre performance dips and gains around the city. Both the poor graphics and performance makes the game pretty much unplayable. Overall, I'm quite disappointed with what I've experienced so far with Chrono Odyssey. When I saw the trailers for this game, the graphics and combat looked incredible. Now I've actually played the game, I've realised neither the graphics or combat is anywhere near as good as the developers made them out to be. Adding on top of the boring questing, terrible voice acting, abysmal performance, weird lighting glitches, and the choice of Unreal Engine 5, and all of the other issues, makes the future of this game not look so bright. That being said, the developers seem like they have come up with an interesting world, especially when considering the stunning landscapes and iconic theme, so there is somewhat of a foundation to build upon, especially when you consider that this is all based on an early alpha build of the game. If the developers continue to work on this game and fix the issues present, then I think it can slide itself in as a decent MMORPG game. However, I think most people would agree that there is a ton of work to be done, and many players as well as myself wouldn't be surprised if the developers make an official announcement on a delay later this year. I also just want to mention here as well that other content creators and users online have pointed out that the developers of this game have copied environmental assets from New World. I left this until the end as I only heard about this after I already played and summarized my thoughts on the game. As far as I'm aware, in the early development of games, developers will sometimes use assets from other games they draw inspiration from, eventually replacing them with their own. Obviously, in a publicly released product, this is not something that should have been there. It just doesn't look good on the developer's end and come across like they don't really care about their game or are even trying. Anyway, that's pretty much it for this video. Let me know your thoughts on Chrono Odyssey in the comments. What do you think about the game? Do you think it will succeed? What do you like and not like based on what you saw in the video? If you thought this video was helpful and want to see more like this, then do sub to the channel. You can also find my social media using the handles present on screen. Otherwise, thank you for watching and I'll be back soon.